Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the TTArtisan 21mm F1.5 aspherical lens. Now, this is designed for a variety of full-frame mirrorless mounts, and so I'm actually testing the Canon RF mount here. It also comes in a Nikon Z or Z mount. It comes in two different Leica mounts, Leica M and Leica L, of course the Leica M being slightly modified and more expensive, and then it also comes in Sony E mount. Now, when it comes to some of the options, like the Leica options, particularly Leica L, or and I think most particularly Sony FE, there are a lot of different lenses to choose from at a variety of price points. However, on the two platforms like Canon RF and Nikon Z or Z, there's relatively few lenses there, and particularly very few value-oriented wide-angle, wide-aperture lenses. And so in this case, getting a 21mm f1.5 lens for a price point of under $250 is very rare and unique at this point. Now, for that money, you're also getting a manual focus, manual aperture, manual everything kind of lens, so not necessarily everyone's cup of tea. And as we're going to see as we explore this lens today, there are other ways that makes this lens not for everyone. There are some fairly strong optical flaws, but it also has a certain amount of character that appeals to some photographers that are more about the overall feel of images than they are about, having perfectly corrected modern design of lenses. And so if that happens to be one of you, this may be an interesting proposition for you. I want to thank the sponsor of today's episode, which is Phantom Wallets. Today's episode is brought to you by Phantom Wallet, the minimalist, modern wallet that sets you free from a bulky traditional wallet while also making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. Visit phantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber. You can even customize your wallet with new accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even the Chipolo tracking integration if you're the kind of person who loses their wallet. Use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out. So we're going to start by taking a closer look hands-on at this lens, the build, the handling of it for, a relatively small price point. What kind of build quality are you getting? Let's dive in, let's take a look. So like many of these boutique Chinese lens makers, as I call them, we actually have a really nice construction here. Everything is made out of metal, and everything is etched into the actual lens barrel itself. There's a very nice looking metal lens mount. What you will see though is there's no electronics of any kind, and so no XF information will communicate. You'll have to, if you have a body that has in-body image stabilization, you're going to have to input all that information yourself. There's also a very high blade count of 10 aperture blades here, and the only downside I have of this particular aperture is that it is kind of hard to produce sun stars from it, and so maybe a lower blade count would have been better. So we have an aperture from f1.5 to f16, and you can see we have a pretty nice focus throw range of about 170 degrees of rotation. And so that is enough to have accurate focus throughout. The aperture ring also works nicely with 1/2 stop detents in between the major aperture stops. So both the aperture ring and the focus ring move nicely. Now there's a dual approach to the front of the camera. You can have either the fitting over the fixed lens hood cap, and so you can see there is a very shallow fixed lens hood here, but that precludes using traditional filters in this situation. And so there is no place to put on screw-on filters, and the cap is a compression style that fits over the top of the lens itself and pops into place. But there is an extra accessory that is included, and that allows you to thread on an additional piece. There are threads that are there behind the actual fixed lens hood, and so you can screw this piece into place, and just got to thread onto those, and that does allow you then to have filter threads for traditional filters in a 72mm front filter size. And so, of course, the other thing is that the original compression cap doesn't work, and so there is a secondary lens cap that is included. In this case, it threads on. It's very slim, and it's basically just like a cover that threads into place. I don't love it, mostly because it's kind of finicky, and as you can see, it takes a lot of rotations to actually tighten it down into place, and so that part is not my favorite. However, at least they have included a way to use traditional filters on this particular lens. Now, the lens itself is 63 millimeters in diameter. It is 73 millimeters in overall length and weighs in at a fairly hefty 412 grams due to the all-metal construction. That being said, though, it is very nicely constructed, and though there's a lot missing, what's here is quite nice. So, like we've come to expect from a lot of these various Chinese lens manufacturers like TTArtisan, the build quality is always surprisingly good. It's not necessarily sophisticated in that you're not getting the suite of electronics, any kind of electronics, obviously no autofocus, and no features beyond that. But what you do get is all metal construction, a nicely damped focus ring and an aperture ring that works just fine. So, as far as what is here, the build quality is quite nice. And of course, having a provision for filter threads certainly is welcome, even though this lens is somewhat of an oddball in terms of its, kind of physical design. In terms of focusing, of course, these days, modern mirrorless cameras make it much easier to do manual focus. Now, one thing I will point out is that if you're shooting one of the Canon bodies, for example, like I am, you're not going to be able to use Canon's excellent focus guide. That's the kind of thing where the two arms come together as you get too close to focus, for the simple reason is that there is no electronics here. And for whatever reason, that seems to work, unlike, focus overlays, that seems to work in some kind of conjunction with electronics. And so anyway, that's a limitation you might want to be aware of. But I was able to get, fairly accurately focus results, being able, of course, to magnify the image on the viewfinder or use one of those focus overlays, makes manual focus much easier than it was back in the DSLR days. And if you're someone that is kind of into hyper focusing, you do have a wide variety of options printed on here for hyperfocal, if that is your, preferred way of achieving manual focus. So how about the image quality? This is a really nuanced conversation, as I noted in our intro. And so we're going to dive in and we're going to show you images and talk about it where you can actually see rather than me just trying to describe it for you. Let's take a look. So let's start off by taking a look at our vignette and distortion. As far as distortion goes, you can see that there's a fairly mild amount of a barrel distortion. You can also see, however, that it is a little bit non-linear, and so to get a fairly even correction across the top, which, there's still a little tiny bit of wave left to it, you can see that it overcorrects the sides a bit. And so, unfortunately, it could be a little bit more linear, but that's what we've got to work with. Vignette, on the other hand, is quite heavy. It's also quite persistent, and you can see by looking here that we also don't have a very flat plane of focus. You can see how that the corners get really soft relative to the center of the frame. Correction involved using a +6 for the distortion, and then almost all the way over for the vignette, with the midpoint far over to the left. I estimate about 3.5 stops of vignette in the extreme corners, and so obviously it's going to require a lot of correction. Now, one other negative is that there is not going to be any kind of JPEG correction in camera. In some ways, this is a lens that works better if you either like the look, even with heavy vignette, or you're someone that shoots RAW, because RAWs are typically easier to correct than our JPEGs that don't receive in-camera correction. Now, one quirk that I noticed due to the heavy amount of vignette is that wide open, I got a little bit of a variance in terms of both metering and then also white balance relative to shooting at smaller apertures. And so in this case, you can see that the wide open image tended to be a little bit on the cool side and even slightly overexposed. My experience most typically is that white balance was more neutral when shooting at smaller apertures, but I tended towards underexposure. And so in many cases, I had to actually raise the exposure. The fact that it's not consistent across, it's not always biased in one direction, makes it a little bit harder to just dial in exposure compensation. And again, I feel like a RAW shooter is going to get better latitude here just because RAW files have more latitude for processing them. I actually didn't see a lot of lateral chromatic aberration along the edge of the frame, which frankly kind of surprised me. But as you can see from this image, there is a little bit of longitudinal chromatic aberration that's mostly going to show up as a little bit of fringing, either before or after the plane of focus. In many cases, however, your depth of field is going to be deep enough that you're really not going to see this effect very often. This was the most extreme example I could come up with. Now, I'm doing this review on a 45 megapixel Canon EOS R5, and in many ways, this lens, particularly at wider apertures, is not really up to resolving a sensor this demanding. So you probably will find better looking results using it on a lower resolution sensor. So for example, looking at the MTFs here, you can see looking at the more demanding, the gray is what I'm looking at here. You can see that MTF, as you start from the center and work towards the edge of the frame, it's not a huge drop off, but it doesn't start particularly high and it ends quite low in an absolute sense. If we look at the lower line reading, so this is kind of at a lower resolution, you can see that the results are obviously significantly better, and better still if you're stopped down. And so stopped down, that actually is quite a nice, this is to f8, it's quite a nice result. But you can see that if you're at the higher resolution, even the yellow here, you can see that it still is not fantastic, particularly in the corners, even at f8. So we're going to find a lot of those same truths as we go to our test chart here. Now remember, this is at 200% magnification. That's the way I do all of these, so it really does show up flaws. What I find here looking in the center of the frame is that contrast is low. As you can see, there's like that little bit like a Vaseline smeared across the front of the lens kind of look. At the same time, resolution in the center of the frame is not too bad, as you can see. If we move to the mid frame, it's the same kind of thing, just a little bit weaker in terms of the textures. If we go down to the extreme corner, however, you can see that the acuity is just really not fantastic. And the further you get towards the end, everything's just kind of going to mush. I will also note that the copy that I tested, at least, was not really all that well centered. And so the upper corner here looks, well, like that. And so anyway, that's something to bear in mind. And if we look from side to side, you can see it's, again, falling off towards the edge. This doesn't look too bad here. And if we look up in this corner, we can see that it's fairly mushy as well. Stopping on down to f2 gives us a little bit of a bump in contrast, not overly significant in the center of the frame. A little bit better in the mid frame, as you can see. And down here, contrast is starting to improve. Textures have a little bit more crispness. They're still not quite there. We go on down to f2.8, and we see that contrast is improving. And if we go on to f4, we see that it's starting to look quite good. And at f5.6, better still, to where finally I would say the corners are looking quite excellent. We can find now that the center of the frame looks awesome, but the top left here, it still just doesn't look all that great. And so that centering issue is still a bit of a problem. So one thing that I noted is that at f1.4, if we're looking closer to the center of the frame, this is wide open. Things really don't look too bad here. I mean, there's not too much bleeding that's going on. Everything looks fairly well defined. Detail is not too bad. We go on down and you see that, you start to lose that distinctive edge. There's like a little bit of line doubling and all of that that's taking place. But, if at this kind of distance, I would say that it certainly is, good enough to give you, I think, globally acceptable images. What I noted, though, is that if I focused at infinity, this lens just really can't hardly handle the, that kind of demanding situation. And so what we can see is that the textures are just not really all that well defined, even in the center of the frame. And if we move off towards the edge, it becomes more like an impressionist painting or a watercolor rather than a photograph. Stopping on down to f5.6 makes a radical difference, as you can see here, even on the edge of the frame. And if we're looking in the center of the frame, everything looks really, really fantastic. Very good contrast, nice and crisp. And so in this image, there's a little bit of fall off right towards the edge. The corners are never really amazingly sharp. But, I mean, for this image, I would say that I'm quite pleased with the overall look of this image. Whereas, obviously it doesn't hold up the same way wide open like that. Now, minimum focus distance is only 50 centimeters, and with a wide-angle lens, that's a really, really low figure. And so, believe it or not, this is the maximum magnification right here, which is definitely the lowest that I have ever seen. It's so much so that it doesn't even look like I'm, targeting in on the actual bill here that I use for my minimum focus. And so, if there's any upside, again, the detail doesn't look too bad, and the plane of focus is well, looking at the middle object, relatively flat, but if you're looking at the image as a whole, it's obviously not flat at all. So a really, really low figure for magnification. Now, what that means is that there's going to be very rare situations where you can create a lot of defocus, because typically with a wide-angle lens, you get a blurred out background mostly by getting close. So in this case, this was as close as what I could get. And so in trying to create the bokeh circles, there's not much to see even at f1.5. You stop the lens down and that's going to pretty much go away altogether. In this case, the result I think is a little bit better because the background is further away. And so you can see here that the bokeh circles don't look too bad. What I do see is that everything really wants to outline. And so that's going to create more busyness in, less easy situations. In this case, I wasn't able to get a lot of separation here, and you can see that, you've got a little bit of that. Anything that's high contrast, this lens just can't handle at wide apertures. And so, you can take a look at the overall image. To me, there's a little bit of busyness in some of that due to not having much separation of the subject from the background. In other situations, however, I thought that there was a fairly decent three-dimensional quality to this image. And you can see that wide open, again, the acuity is not amazing here, but there's something about the image that I think is visually appealing. I think this image also worked to me getting down low and having some foreground blurred out and a little bit of the background blurred out. I think that this overall image I like, as does this one, even though, again, if I zoom in, the detail is not mind-blowing. It's not bad, and there's a little bit of busyness in this transition zone here, but the area back here looks, fairly soft. Now, one thing I did really like is I felt like the color in certain situations was really unique and desirable to me. And so in this case, I really like the overall look of this image. This has not been processed or edited. And, it's nice and crisp in the center of the frame, good contrast, but it's mostly the feel of the image that I actually really like. Likewise, this image, I felt like the color was nice and stopped down. The contrast looks nice in the image as well. Here's another, or just, it's an overcast day, but there's a vibe to this image that I like, and the contrast in the, the sharp area looks very nice. One final image here, and on an early spring morning, you can see that just the colors are very nice and rich, but have kind of a unique feel to them that maybe is not technically accurate, but produces really desirable images put in the right situation. What's not so good is the overall flare resistance, and there really isn't much of flare resistance. You can see that at wide open, you're going to get this really big circle, which I don't actually mind so much. It's kind of a vintage film effect that's kind of cool. I'm never too crazy about these kind of blobs because they're very hard to edit out. The bad news, though, is that if you stop down enough to get a sunburst effect, you really unleash the Kraken in terms of just blobs of color and light and just prismatic effect. It can be pretty bad in certain situations. So you're going to have to be really careful with your composition. Here's another example here where, in a vertical format, that, main blob is allowed to kind of dominate there. And so, to me, I don't necessarily love that, and that's basically impossible to edit out. So finally, let's talk about chroma. Obviously, a wide angle, wide aperture lens is always going to be an option for shooting the night sky, and particularly those that are on a tight budget. Now, the bad news here is that there is some chroma smear, even towards the center of the frame. You can see that the, the star points are not like perfectly crisp, and then as you move off towards the edge, the wings get bigger and bigger, and this is one of the poorer performances that I've seen. If I stop it down to f2, you can see that the wings shrink, and at f2.8, they become a little bit better here. The wings mostly disappear, and it's now a little bit more like wedges. but at no point is this lens, unfortunately, really amazing for shooting night sky. Again, if it's all you got, then go ahead and shoot with it. But as you can see, it suffers with a little bit of coma, even stopped down quite a bit to f2.8. So in many of the ways that I test lenses, this lens does not test particularly well, as you've just seen. It's a lens that has, as I said, a nuanced, somewhat complicated optical performance that is very much like a lot of vintage glass. At the same time, however, it can achieve really nice looking results. And as I noted as we went through, there's something about the overall color rendering that in certain scenes I really quite like. And I think that that might be the attraction for some individuals. So are there better options? There certainly are. There are options that are more competent at wider apertures, that have better coma performance for shooting astrophotography, that are sharper in the corners and more flare resistant and have less vignette, any of those things. None of them, however, are going to give you a 21mm lens with a very large maximum aperture and a very low price point. Right now at B&H Photo, this lens is $239 US. Which, in many ways, it's a lot of lens for that money, and not a lens you're going to be able to easily rival. So maybe if you're someone that shoots a wide-angle focal length, but rarely, this might be an alternative. If you're on a tight budget, it might be a nice option for you. Or if you just happen to like some of the quirkiness of it, it also might work in your case. And if you do a lot of video work, sometimes just having a good manual focus ring can make all the difference in the world and will work better for your purposes than would an autofocus designed lens. At the end of the day, I do think there's a market for a lens like this, and particularly if you're on Canon RF or Nikon Z, and there just really aren't a lot of options, this may be one that at the very least can tide you over until something that's a little more mainstream comes your way, or maybe you're just quirky and you like lenses with a little bit of quirky quality. If so, the TTArtisan 21mm F1.5 aspherical is going to be right down your alley. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review. There's also linkage there to an image gallery if you want to check out photos. Beyond that, there are some buying links there. There's linkage to buy some of my merchandise, lens theme merchandise. There's also linkage there to follow me on social media, to become a patron, to sign up for my newsletter. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Be sure to ring that bell and get notification when new content drops. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.